Dr. Peter Cook will speak first. Peter has an MA and PhD in Communication Studies from Simon Fraser University in Canada. And he has a very diverse background. He's worked as a beekeeper, university lecturer, public policy researcher, digital media project manager, and senior executive in the non-profit sector. He's vice president of SPA, coordinator of the SPA discussion paper series, and co-author of several of these papers. And of particular relevance, he and the next speaker are co-authors of the major SPA paper on water use. So, Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much. I like having that characterization as a diverse background. Yes, if there were one factor that you would think would constrain the further growth of Australia's population, you would surely think it would be water. It's a commonplace that Australia is the driest inhabited continent in the world, and water, many of us here are involved in SPA, I'm sure we've often used water as the go-to argument, about population constraint. So in 2020, we, as in the SPA executive, agreed to dig down as part of our discussion paper series, to dig down further into this question of water and to test these claims a bit more to see what actually was going on. We invited Jonathan Sobels to become involved, and also along the way, we invited Sandra Kank and Jane O'Sullivan, and of course myself was involved. So 4 years or more later, we finally published a paper as one of our discussion papers. And one of the reasons it took so long was a question of scope, because water is as complex and diverse as the size of this continent, basically. So, did we include the Murray-Darling? Did we look at Northern Australia? Did we look at Indigenous use of water? And of course, then there is urban water, which is what we ended up focusing on. The big cities, and it's where all the people live, and most likely it's going to be where most of the future people will live too in terms of population growth. So, spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you right away what our conclusion is. Stabilising our population size, as in ending population growth, is by far the cheapest, simplest, greenest and safest way to guarantee Australia's water security. And we certainly think there are solid arguments and evidence to back that up. However, we know that that's not the only view out there. In fact, the dominant view is what I will characterise as the big Australia view. It's a view that population in Australia can just keep growing to some indefinite period, and that water is not a constraint to that. In some way, we will find a way. That is usually the kind of argument, and particularly through some kind of technology, such as desalination. So this is the mainstream view. It's very common, in all of the areas of political life. We are the driest continent. We also have great variability in our rainfall and stream flow and so on, which in the 20th century led the engineers to over-design all of our big dams for the big cities, just so they had more storage capacity for the lean years. Much of the water is in the north, and it all goes into the sea up there. Rainfall is decreasing, as you can see in the southern parts here. The red and the orange means very much below average or lowest on record over the past 30 years compared to the previous century or so. So definitely a drying trend of less water. 2000 to 2010 was a pivotal decade in water in Australia. One of the huge reasons was the Millennium Drought. which forced people to take action in various ways. We had the National Water Initiative, which set up a national, state, federal framework for much better cooperation and regulation in the area. The Water Act 2007, which then resulted in the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, which is implemented from about 2012 onwards. You have urban water consumption reaching the limits of conventional sources. Improvements in water efficiency happen largely due to the drought. And we saw the beginning of large-scale desalination, like 50, 100 gigalitre type plants, which are big. In terms of the policy discourse, which I neglected to say, that'll also be one of the topics that I'm speaking on here. We saw a change in the discourse from the Water Services Association of Australia, which is the peak body for all of the water authorities that build the dams and provide the water services in our big cities. And they began to talk about a diverse portfolio of options, because they could no longer rely on just having a big dam that was going to fill full of water. So they had to be looking at rainwater tanks, desalination, water recycling, use of urban water, much more water efficiency measures. So that's what they meant by the diverse portfolio. And in the report cited there, in 2010, the Water Services Association of Australia published a report on population growth and water supply into the future, up to around 2056 or so, I think. In the preface to that, it stated they were confident that they can provide water, they can promise water, regardless of the population growth that Australia experiences. And that has been the line that has been pushed from then on. That, you know, no matter what happens, no matter what size population, we can deliver the water. And I guess that's where we would like to question that in terms of like how risky and how costly that may end up being, if it is possible. Part of our research, we thought it would be good to start by looking at recent historical trends of actual water use in Australia. And so for that purpose, we were able to use ABS data. And this is the first time it's actually been done, to do a time series of this. And we also linked it back to another survey that was done in 1977. So it's an interesting chart in that over that period that you're looking at there, it's a bit compressed in the time scale at the end here, but you get the idea. Our population doubled basically from 13.2 million in 1977 to just a couple of years ago in 2022. And you can see there hasn't been an actual increase in water. In fact, water usage, in fact, it has been slightly decreasing. You can see the big change is in water for agricultural use. This is the blue here. And one of, obviously, the Millennium Drought was a big factor in there. I mean, you can see the decline there, and also more regulation of the Murray-Darling Basin also prevented it from going back up again, I would suspect. So quite a bit less for agriculture. The green part along the top there, that is residential. That's the household water sector, which is what we were particularly interested in, because that's, you know, about people living their daily lives in the big cities. How much water would they use? And interesting, I mean, it's very hard to see much difference there looking at it. So just to, even though this is even harder to, but this is that green part extracted into numbers. So you can see around 2000, it was about 2,200 gigalitres, the household sector. Then it went down to just 2010-11, right down to 1,700 gigalitres. And then it's been creeping up gradually So it's now, over the last few years, it's been over 1,900 gigalitres. A slow increase. Now, another piece of the puzzle here, and this is a very interesting chart that Jonathan uncovered from a CSIRO book that was put out in 2011, but it's showing the usage of water, or in this case, consumption for each city in the green, and what the estimate was of how much water there is that we have, like in terms of what's in the dam, what can we provide through our existing water infrastructure. And you'll see in many cases, well, in some cases, it even, like in Sydney, you can see the consumption is even higher than what's available, what they call on a sustainable yield basis. But all of them are very close to the limit. In other words, there ain't no more water to come from those sources. So that is why this decade in 2000 and 2010 is such a pivotal one, because the water planners had to pivot really to looking at other sources of water, and how to deal with that. Building dams, generally speaking, around the big cities is not feasible for many different reasons, but the good sites have largely been used in any case. But to build them now, you'd be looking at all sorts of extra environmental issues, I'm sure, if it were even possible. That little picture there really does say a lot. Now, the other thing we did, using the same data we had from ABS, we calculated a per capita daily use in the household sector. And you see the trend here from about, certainly it's declining, and it's declined by about 2010-11. And then over here, you see very little. I mean, yes, it's very hard to see a real trend there. It's quite stable. These are averages, of course. Each city is a bit different, but 200 litres a day is basically the per person per day in the household sector. That is the average. And why is this important? Because we saw in the other chart, our consumption up to now and in recent times has been relatively stable. Our overall usage of water has been relatively stable. We've seen, however, that the household sector is gradually starting to creep up. But this is all about the question of efficiency, of how much more efficiencies can we actually get in the household sector. Those efficiencies are declining, and Melbourne Water has admitted as much itself. It's saying, we cannot get a lot more efficiency because we're already, a lot less use of gardens. We've got water standards, appliance standards in place. We've got many efficiency measures now in place for water usage. The housing stocks has got new requirements. The houses are smaller. There's not so many gardens. All of that means it's harder and harder to get more efficiencies. The important point out of all that is that if population then does continue to grow, then water has to come from somewhere, because the per capita levels are not going to decline markedly. Now, they may decline, and there are still a lot of work being done on efficiency in water use. But for example, Queensland, the South East Queensland Water Authority, has said in its reports it's not aiming for any further reduction over the next 20 or 30 years. They're sitting at about 160 or so litres per day. Melbourne has a very ambitious target of trying to get to 100 litres per day by 2070. But a study I have seen suggests that 100 litres per day is actually right at the bare minimum that for a comfortable existence. So Perth is still up there around profligate 249 litres per day. So they possibly could. Perth could get it down somewhat. And of course, they've got all those bores they're using over there too. So yes, you can get the water get a little bit more efficiency, but at some point there won't be a lot. There won't be any. And the important point there is that the water has to come from somewhere. I felt I had to include this one. I just discovered this the other day, but this is Western Australia, a time series from 1941. The orange zigzag is the stream flow. And you can see it's almost down to very close to zero. This is the water increase. There's population increase. And you can see here that teal coloured section is introduction of desalination. So you can see the water coming from, I mean, Perth, WA is a really extreme case here that the water supply has fallen off a cliff and they've had to bring in a lot of desalination. But I thought that was a really interesting, I just discovered it the other day in one of the state government infrastructure reports. As part of that same story, this is from the BOM data, it's showing each city, and the green is showing the introduction of desal. So you can see for Perth, this is from 2013 to 2021, but you can see Perth is heavily committed to desalination. But you can see other cities now creeping in here, starting to use desal as well. This is the trend. They have to find water from somewhere. They can't get it from the traditional conventional rain-fed sources, which includes stream flow and into the dams, as well as groundwater. Desalination is, and there's been a heck of a lot of debate about the capital cost and so on, but desalination has been the chosen method. So this is the continuing story. The outlook for the future, there are some basic things that we do know, I think, and one of them that from now on, population growth will drive up demand for water, and it always has to some degree, but it certainly will more so now that efficiencies have been to a big extent exhausted. Population growth will drive demand for water. So we know that. We know that climate change is going to drive the supply of water down through the drying trend. And of course, the heating trend, which means capital cities will be getting hotter, the urban heat island effect. And they ideally will need even more water if they're going to try to counteract that urban heat island and try to construct more urban tree canopy. One study that was cited in the Productivity Commission report recently was that, I think it was for Adelaide, if they wanted to increase tree canopy by 20%, it would require 10 to 30% increase in water usage. So, you know, that's the other end of it. The water demand is going up. There's no question. The supplies are going down, and we actually need more of it to keep our cities cooler. Now, in terms of the future, we trawled through the Water Authority's strategy documents, but I've summarised it here just in terms of this is the extra population down here. That's the extra population that's envisaged in our major mainland capital cities. Over the next, say, 30 to 40 years, 10 to 15 million people is kind of what they're working with. That's what they're thinking. That will require, depending, and this very much does depend on the population forecast. You can see the direct correlation between the population forecast and the amount of extra water they say they will require. But it's saying 850 gigalitres to 1450 gigalitres extra water will be needed over the period roughly 2050 to 2070. That is a kind of summary of the overall national outlook. We do need extra water, and a big chunk of that is envisaged to come from what is now called manufactured water, climate independent water. This is a quote from Melbourne Water, who did what is probably one of the best strategy documents that I saw in terms of I trawled through these. I mean, they did do a good job. But they're saying we are transitioning to a manufactured water supply. this transition could see 80% of Greater Melbourne's water supply coming from manufactured water sources such as recycled water and desalination by 2070 as compared to 35% now. A big chunk of that 80% would be desalination. Some of it would also be recycling, and Jonathan's going to dig down a bit further on desalination and recycling in his talk. Yes, this is a huge transition that is occurring in terms of where we get one of our most fundamental life requirements. And I don't think really it's understood in the general community just how big that change is. We went through a lot of water policy documents, including what I just mentioned and a lot of other documents. We identified what we called the population blind spot, which is that population is seen as a driver of demand, no doubt, of a driver of water demand, but it is not recognised as a policy choice that the levels of population can be modified, or the growth rate can be reduced, put it that way, particularly through our migration programs. So we do have that option as a policy choice, but nowhere in the policy discourse is that recognised. Instead, there is a fatalistic acceptance of population projections, which does contradict somewhat the earlier statement I cited from the Water Services Association, where they say all options are on the table. In fact, they're not on, all options aren't on the table, because that one question of population size is not on the table. And so that's what we're actually arguing for in the paper, is that it should be on the table. I couldn't resist quoting, showing a couple of quotes from the recent Productivity Commission report on national water reform. It goes through, stating what the challenges are ahead, and they are significant. And it says, to deal with these challenges efficiently and at least cost, all options need to be available and evaluated on their merits, even though those that are politically difficult. Now, these are highly paid professionals, but they don't have a sense of irony. Now, another quote, governments often rule out options for water security for political reasons without due consideration of the actual costs and benefits, so-called policy bans. Policy bans potentially result in outcomes that are not lowest cost or efficient. They are almost never justified on economic grounds. So a lot of this comes down to some very deep kind of, I guess I would call them ideological components of our culture and of people, which are basically a deep-seated faith in technology. Jane O'Sullivan and I had the pleasure of appearing before a Senate, the Joint Standing Committee on Migration. They were doing the report that came out not that long ago, actually, on migration pathway to nation building. So we put in a submission, and we were very surprised to actually get an invite. So we went along. This just is an example of what we're really up against, I think. But we had a bit of an exchange about, what is the carrying capacity of Australia and so on, like how many people could we really support? And basically, Maria Van Varkenu, who is actually just recently retired, she's not seeking re-election, but she has been a member there, an active member of Parliament for about 20 years, I think. She was the chair of the committee. She said, I'm suggesting that nothing is impossible where humanity, ingenuity and technology are involved. If that means settling people in Australian deserts, then maybe that's what they will do. Now, you can't argue with that, really. It's very hard to sort of have rational argument when people are putting up those kinds of, I guess it would be fanciful schemes. I call it the siren call of the mega project. It's whether it's watering the deserts or the Bradfield scheme, redirecting the Burdekin River, down to the Murray-Darling. I mean, these are very pie in the sky schemes, but that is what we're left with in many of these claims, that we can just keep growing population more or less indefinitely. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Yes, any sort of discussion of growth, limiting growth in consumption, whether it's due to population growth or growth in GDP per person, is politically off the table.